traditional event hosted by the History Department and the Center for the Study of War and Society, the annual Memorial Charles Johnson Lecture. My name is Veas Gabriel-Levichus. I teach in the History Department and direct the center. And this event today, this lecture, honors the founder of the Center for the Study of War and Society, Dr. Chuck Johnson, who more than 25 years ago had an insight that now is pretty much common knowledge and accepted wisdom, but for those days was really visionary and prophetic. And that insight was that one should not just study military history in a narrow technical way, the movements of armies or the outcomes of battles, but instead to look at how war affects individuals and society, what the human impact is of conflict. And this was a remarkable insight for the time. Now, lots of universities have fields of study called War and Society, and Chuck was really ahead of his time. His project that he began with was to record oral histories of the Second World War. And it was this oral history project that led to the establishment of the center and the ambitions and the hopes that we have for it in the present day. I'd like to just introduce a few people before I introduce our speaker for today. We're especially proud at the center of our undergraduate interns. And I see several of them here today. Could you please stand up if you're one of our undergraduate interns? Or at least one who has turned up today. Our interns are prize-winning interns because in a recent undergraduate research competition, they won an award for their work in historical editing. And if you're an undergraduate who's interested in the internship experience at the center, please speak to me afterwards. We also have assistants at the center who are prize-winning. The gentleman behind the camera is Mike McConnell, who is our graduate assistant, who won the Guggenheim Dissertation Writing Fellowship, the first time that anyone has won this fellowship in our program. And a colleague of his, Josh Sander, is not able to be here today because he won another fellowship, a fellowship to the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. And we're very proud of the tremendous record of fellowships that our graduate students have won. If you are already on our mailing list, we're very grateful for your participation in our messaging program. If you're not yet on our mailing list, if you don't receive our free newsletter yet, we have cards as well as copies of some of our literature and recent newsletter editions. But we have cards that you can fill out and sign up in order to receive some of our communications and learn about upcoming events at the center. So it's my great pleasure now to introduce our guest speaker, who will be giving a lecture entitled Trenches, Women, Jokes, and the Enemy, German, British, and French Soldier Newspapers During the First World War. He is Dr. Robert Nelson and is an international authority on the First World War, the centennial of which we're currently marking. He's a native of British Columbia in Canada. He's trained at Cambridge University and was a student of J. Windsor, one of the deans of First World War history. And currently, Professor Nelson is Associate Professor of Modern European History at the University of Windsor, Canada. His fields of specialization include the study of war, occupation, and European colonialism. He is the author of the book published by Cambridge University Press in 2011 entitled German Soldier Newspapers of the First World War, and editor of the volume published by Palgrave entitled Germans, Poland, and Colonial Expansion to the East, 1850 to the Present. His work has been featured in the journals Social History and International History Review, and he's been awarded, frankly, an astonishing series of prestigious grants, including Germany's Alexander von Humboldt Fellowship, the SSHRC Research Grant, the Ontario Early Researcher Award, the Crone Teaching Award, and the Killam Postdoctoral Fellowship. And his current research project investigates Germany's push for colonies in Eastern Europe between the 1880s and 1918. Please join me in welcoming Professor Robert Nelson.
I'll time myself, don't worry. Thanks for the wonderful introduction. I'd like to thank the Department of History,
the Center for the Study of War and Society, and specifically it's an honor to give this Charles Johnson Memorial Lecture because Charles Johnson really was ahead of his time. The study of what happens in the heads of soldiers in wartime was really cutting edge in 1984 when this center started. I mean, the top down, what the generals think, and soldiers as a bunch of numbers at the end of the battle was the way military history was classically done. And to be able to give really the kind of lecture that I think he would have been happy to have heard here is an honor today. So it is a lecture about, well, within the framework of this new military history, social military history. What happens, what do soldiers think about in the First World War? British, French, and German soldiers. How do we get at the thoughts of normal soldiers, of upper class, middle class, lower class? We need good sources. So, already in the 80s, the first attempt to figure out what they were thinking in the First World War begins with letters. Okay, you'd be familiar with this from the Civil War. Here, and the beginning of a certain documentarian's career on the History Channel, having people slowly read out the letters of Civil War soldiers while you pan in and out and around still photographs to make it look like a movie. Ken. So Ken had a lot of effect on a lot of historians, and in Germany and Britain, people started looking at these letters. Of course, there are millions of letters for soldiers in the First World War. You had a static front in the West. 4 years of literate soldiers, German, French, and British, all with all the time in the world while they're behind the lines, sometimes in the trenches, but often behind the lines to write letters. And they wrote every day, sometimes several times a day. So, a great way to get at the social history of soldiers. Problems with it? So we got tons of great information from those letters. The problems with those letters, first of all, there are millions of them. Okay? This is not some nice category of research for a PhD student to go and read a million letters and then write a dissertation about it. You've got to pick, and every time you start picking, of course, there's a problem of representation. Who did you pick? Sometimes the dissertation is written based on 5 people because they wrote 500 or more letters each. Okay? How representative are those 5 Germans of the German experience? That's one problem with letters. Another problem with letters, you have to be someone who writes. And so, naturally, letters tended to heavily represent people with more education from higher levels of class in society. Not as many letters written by working class soldiers in the First World War. So there's that bias as well with those letters. Another huge problem with letters, there are some big gaps, some big things that aren't discussed in soldiers' letters. And that comes from the audience of soldiers' letters. The audience for a soldier's letter was mom, girlfriend, or wife. That's the major audience for all those millions of letters. How often do you think the soldiers talked about the brothels in those letters? How often did they talk about their French girlfriend in those letters? Never. Yeah, you're right. Right. Never. There are no women anywhere near the Western Front if you look at the letters of the First World War. And when you look at the soldier newspapers of the First World War, newspapers written by soldiers for other soldiers, women, turned out, were everywhere near the front lines, just behind the lines in the First World War. So that's the kind of problem you run up against when you use letters. So, in searching for other interesting sources of social history for the First World War, well, I wanted to do something like that. So I wanted to work in Cambridge. I mean, it's the Ivy League for us Canadians, right? We tend to go to Oxbridge for our top degrees. We're in the colony, we go back to the mother country, is how we see it. Okay? So I wanted to go there, and so I located this famous historian at Cambridge, J. Winter, and I sent him a fax in 1996, including my electronic mail address in the fax, in case he knew what that technology was. Sure enough, an email appeared in my inbox. He was with it already in 1996. And he said, I've got your dissertation research waiting for you whenever you're ready. Soldier newspapers, trench newspapers of the First World War. If you read all the German ones, all the British ones, and the Dominion armies, so Australians, and most crucially the Canadian newspapers, and the French newspapers. If you read all of them, that's 12,000 newspapers. It can be done for a PhD. It is a set limit of resources. So I said, great, and that's what I did for my PhD. This is the problem with doing a PhD, is you never know when you stop at that certain set of sources and go to other primary sources and more primary. When do you stop and write the dissertation? I, at the beginning, knew I had the set limit that I'd be able to do the comparative way of the British, French, and German newspapers. So that's what I started on and did my dissertation, and that's what I'm going to talk about today. So, first part of my talk is going to be about those sources. How did they get produced? Who are the authors? How they produced, distributed, and censorship. So, tell you about these sources, because these sources exist for many wars and have not been read by historians for many wars. I'll end the talk today pointing out a few examples from American history that are untapped, largely untapped. So I'll talk about those sources, and then the second part will be telling you some of those major themes. A bit about humor, a bit about the enemy, and a bit about women, the people that don't exist in those letters. So, the authors, first of all. The editors, I should say. All of these newspapers had editorial teams that obviously edited and controlled what's in the newspapers, but in terms of authorship, all of these newspapers published material sent in to them by soldiers, constantly asking for material to be sent in by soldiers, and then publishing that material by soldiers. So, authorship is the language that I use here, but I'm talking about the editors when I talk about identifying the humans in control of these newspapers, okay? But they're not purely the authors of the whole thing. These authors are, first of all, from the kind of backgrounds you would expect. The editors had been authors. They'd worked in the publishing industry. They'd worked in newspapers. They were teachers, okay? What we'd say belletristic background, okay? They knew how to write. They knew how to edit. So obviously that's a certain kind of pre-war background for these editors. Second of all, about half of them are officers, and about half of them are lower ranks, okay, in terms of that power dynamic on the editorial team. For all British, French, and Germans, pretty much the same kind of split. And finally, they were older men. By